The Americans called it the Iron Cathedral. The British called it the three-story disaster. The Soviets called it a coffin for 7 brothers. The Germans laughed and called it a splendid target. In 1941, the M3 medium tank was the most mocked armored vehicle in the world. 10 feet tall, with a gun sticking out of the hull like a warship from 1918, it looked like something that belonged in the previous war. Every army that received one found new ways to insult it. But in May 1942, this joke did something no British tank could do. It stopped Rommel's panzers cold. June 1940, German armor conquered France in 6 weeks. The panzer divisions that shattered the French army weren't superior in numbers. The French actually had more tanks, but German crews were better trained. Their tactics were revolutionary, and their commanders understood how to concentrate armor at decisive points. American military planners watched the newsreels and understood what they were seeing. Modern warfare had changed. Tanks weren't support weapons for infantry anymore. They were the decisive arm. At the time, the United States Army possessed roughly 400 tanks. Most were M2 light tanks armed with machine guns. If America entered the war, its soldiers would face the most experienced armored force in history, with equipment designed for a previous generation. The Army knew exactly what it needed: a medium tank carrying a 75 gun. This wasn't just about the caliber, it was about the ammunition. The weapon could fire armor-piercing rounds to kill enemy tanks and high-explosive rounds to destroy fortifications and infantry positions. Smaller guns couldn't do both. The British 2-pounder 40 lacked an effective high-explosive round, leaving them helpless against anti-tank guns. The 75 was a dual-purpose weapon that offered decisive flexibility. However, American factories couldn't build a proper 75 tank yet. Tank turrets require precision engineering. A 75 gun needed a turret ring over 60 inches in diameter to handle the recoil. In 1940, American foundries couldn't cast rings that large, and the precision machining didn't exist. Building new facilities would take at least 18 months. While the M4 Sherman was already on the drawing board, it wouldn't reach the battlefield until late 1942. The Army needed armor that could fight panzers now. Engineers at Rock Island Arsenal proposed a solution that made everyone uncomfortable: mount the 75 gun in the hull instead of a turret. It was an obsolete concept from World War I. Modern doctrine demanded rotating turrets for flexibility. A hull-mounted sponson gun could only fire in a limited arc. To engage a target on the flank, the entire tank had to turn, a delay that could be fatal in a fast-moving battle. They proposed it anyway because a 75 gun in a sponson was infinitely better than nothing at all. The Army approved development in July 1940, and production began in August 1941. The M3 medium tank stood 10 feet tall. For comparison, the Sherman would be 9 feet, and a modern M1 Abrams is only 8 feet. The M3 towered over everything. This height came from stacking components: an aircraft radial engine in the rear, the 75 sponson in the front right, a small turret with a 37 gun above that, and a commander's cupola on top. 3 levels, 10 feet. A true 3-story disaster. The height alone defined the experience of every crew that climbed inside it. From a distance, the M3 medium tank looked less like a vehicle and more like a moving building, its silhouette impossible to hide on an open battlefield. Enemy gunners could spot it first. Friendly infantry could spot it first. Everyone could spot it first. In an era when concealment often meant survival, the M3 announced its presence long before it fired a shot. Crews understood this immediately, and the psychological weight of operating something so visible shaped every decision they made once combat began. Inside, the design reflected the urgency that created it. Nothing about the M3 was elegant. Everything was functional, layered, and compromised. The driver sat low and forward, with limited visibility through narrow slits that became almost useless in sandstorms or dust. To his right, the 75 gun occupied the sponson, its breech dominating the fighting compartment. The gunner and loader worked in a cramped space, constantly aware that their weapon could not traverse freely. Every engagement required coordination with the driver to align the hull, turning the entire tank into the aiming mechanism. Above them, another crew operated the 37 turret. This smaller gun was intended for anti-tank combat, while the 75 handled infantry, guns, and fortifications. In theory, the M3 could fight multiple targets at once. In practice, the separation of weapons complicated command and control. Communication inside the tank relied on shouted commands, hand signals, and rigid drill. Noise from the engine, the guns, and incoming fire reduced clarity to fragments. The tank demanded discipline from crews, who often had only weeks of training. The commander's cupola, perched at the very top, offered good visibility but added to the vehicle's towering profile. From this position, commanders could observe the battlefield, direct fire, and coordinate movement, but they were also the most exposed. German gunners quickly learned that knocking out the cupola could blind the tank, reducing it to a slow, confused target. Survivability depended less on armor thickness, and more on how the crew managed positioning, timing, and cooperation with supporting units. When the M3 first arrived in British hands in North Africa, reactions ranged from skepticism to outright hostility. British crews were accustomed to tanks designed around smaller guns and lower profiles. The idea of a hull-mounted main weapon felt like a regression, not an innovation. Training accidents and mechanical issues reinforced doubts. Sand infiltrated everything, engines overheated, and maintenance crews struggled to keep the unfamiliar American machinery running in desert conditions. Yet the battlefield imposed its own logic. German Panzer III and early Panzer IV tanks, armed primarily with 50 and short-barreled 75 guns, were formidable but not invincible. British tanks, particularly the Crusader, were fast but lightly armored and undergunned. They could maneuver but struggled to destroy German anti-tank positions or survive sustained engagements. The M3, for all its flaws, brought something new: reliable armor protection and a gun that could kill what it hit. At Gazala and later at El Alamein, this difference became impossible to ignore. The 75 guns' high-explosive rounds shattered German gun crews, suppressed defensive lines, and destroyed positions that had previously stopped British advances cold. For the first time, British armored formations could engage German combined arms defenses without relying entirely on artillery support. The M3 was not graceful, but it was effective in ways that mattered. Rommel noticed immediately. German after-action reports identified the American tank as a significant threat, not because it outmatched German armor tactically, but because it altered the balance of firepower on the battlefield. The Afrika Korps had relied on well-sighted anti-tank guns to break British attacks. The M3's 75 could neutralize those guns from outside the effective range of German tank cannons. This forced changes in German deployment and tactics, stretching already thin resources. The irony was unavoidable. A tank designed as an emergency compromise, mocked for its height and awkward layout, had achieved something more refined designs could not. It bought time. It filled a gap during a critical phase of the war when no better alternative existed. Its presence allowed Allied forces to fight on more equal terms while American industry completed the next step in armored development. Behind the scenes, lessons from the M3 flowed directly into the M4 Sherman. Engineers studied crew feedback, combat reports, and maintenance data. The importance of a fully rotating turret, improved ergonomics, and simplified internal layouts became undeniable. The M3 was never intended to be a long-term solution, and its very shortcomings accelerated the push toward something better. For the men who fought inside it, however, the M3 was not a transitional concept or a production stopgap. It was a steel box that either carried them through battle or became their grave. Its size, its noise, and its limitations shaped every engagement. Crews learned to exploit terrain, coordinate closely with infantry, and strike before the enemy could react. Survival depended on understanding what the tank could not do as much as what it could. By late 1942, as Shermans began arriving in numbers, the M3 quietly faded from frontline service. It was replaced without ceremony, its reputation already sealed by its strange appearance and awkward design. Yet its impact lingered. In the desert, at a moment when defeat still seemed possible, it had changed the calculus of armored warfare. It had taken the laughter out of German assessments and forced respect through performance alone. The M3 medium tank never shed its nicknames, and it never escaped criticism. But in the narrow window between unpreparedness and industrial maturity, it fulfilled a role no other machine could. Its story was not one of perfection, but of necessity, of how war rewards solutions that work now, not those that merely look right on paper. As the M3 disappeared from headlines, its influence continued quietly inside training manuals, doctrine revisions, and the minds of officers who had watched it fight. American armored commanders paid close attention to reports coming back from North Africa, not only about what the tank destroyed, but about how it was used under pressure. They noted that success rarely came from individual vehicles acting alone. It came from coordination between tanks, infantry, artillery, and air power, applied faster than the enemy could react. The M3 had forced this lesson early because its limitations punished sloppy tactics immediately. American crews training stateside absorbed these lessons before ever seeing combat. Instructors emphasized gunnery drills, communication discipline, and rapid maneuver. The awkward requirement to turn the entire hull to bring the 75 gun onto target made coordination between driver and gunner essential. That habit carried forward into Sherman crews, who benefited from a turreted gun but retained the culture of tight internal teamwork. The M3 had inadvertently trained an armored force to think collectively rather than individually. German intelligence assessments reflected this shift. Early dismissals of American armor as crude and inferior began to change tone by mid-1942. Reports from Africa acknowledged that while American tanks were not technologically superior, they were appearing in increasing numbers, supported by logistics and artillery at a scale Germany could not easily match. The M3 symbolized this emerging reality, not brilliance, but mass, adaptability, and speed of production. The tank's presence also exposed weaknesses in German doctrine. Panzer units had been designed to exploit breakthroughs, not to grind against heavily supported armored formations with strong artillery backing. When confronted with M3s advancing behind coordinated barrages, German commanders were forced into reactive positions. Anti-tank guns had to be repositioned, camouflage improved, and defensive depth increased, all of which slowed operational tempo. Time, which Germany could least afford to lose, slipped away in these adjustments. For British forces, the experience was transformative. The M3 restored confidence after a series of painful defeats. Crews who had once felt outmatched now knew they could engage German armor and win under the right conditions. This psychological shift mattered as much as any technical specification. Morale stabilized, training improved, and cooperation between British and American units deepened. The tank became a bridge, not just between designs, but between Allied armies learning how to fight the same war together. The M3's mechanical reliability, often overlooked in critiques of its design, also played a decisive role. While not immune to breakdowns, it proved more dependable than many contemporary British tanks. Engines ran longer, transmissions failed less frequently, and standardized American manufacturing made spare parts easier to obtain. In desert warfare, where maintenance could decide entire campaigns, This reliability translated directly into combat power. As American industry accelerated, production lines refined processes pioneered during the M3's manufacture. Welding techniques, casting methods, and quality control systems improved rapidly. Workers who had never built a tank before became specialists in armored production. By the time the Sherman replaced the M3, the industrial machine behind it was operating at full momentum. The awkward tank had served as both weapon and training tool for a nation learning how to wage mechanized war. The crews who survived their time in M3s carried those experiences forward. Some would later command Shermans in Italy, France, and Germany. Others became instructors, passing on hard-earned lessons about situational awareness, combined arms cooperation, and the cost of hesitation. The tank's reputation never changed, but its influence multiplied quietly through the men shaped by its demands. In this way, the M3's legacy was less about its silhouette and more about its timing. It entered the war at a moment when delay would have been catastrophic. It absorbed criticism so that better designs could emerge without panic. And while history remembers sleeker tanks and decisive breakthroughs, the M3 remains embedded in the deeper story of adaptation under pressure, of an army learning, imperfectly and urgently, how to survive modern war. As the Sherman began to arrive in numbers, the contrast between the two machines sharpened American understanding of what truly mattered in armored warfare. The Sherman was lower, cleaner in design, faster to bring its main gun to bear, and easier to command in combat. Yet officers who had fought in M3s repeatedly emphasized that the Sherman's effectiveness was inseparable from the habits forged earlier. The doctrine of rapid concentration, constant movement, and aggressive coordination had not emerged fully formed with the new tank. It had been beaten into place under the awkward constraints of the M3. This continuity mattered because the enemy was also learning. German commanders did not stand still while Allied armor improved. They introduced heavier tanks, more powerful anti-tank guns, and increasingly sophisticated defensive belts. The battlefield became less forgiving with each passing month. In that environment, technological parity was never guaranteed. What mattered was the ability to adapt faster than the opponent, to absorb losses, replace equipment, and return to the fight with revised methods. The M3 era had conditioned American forces to expect imperfection and work through it rather than wait for ideal solutions. Logistics became the silent backbone of this adaptation. The same industrial system that had rushed the M3 into production now demonstrated its true strategic value. Tanks lost in battle were replaced, not in years, but in weeks. Units rotated equipment without halting operations. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and trained crews flowed forward in volumes that reshaped operational planning. German commanders increasingly faced the reality that destroying an American tank formation did not remove it from the war, it merely delayed it. This imbalance in replacement capacity began to influence decision-making at the highest levels. German armored commanders, once encouraged to seek decisive engagements, grew more cautious. Each lost panzer represented an investment that could not easily be recovered. Each engagement against Allied armor carried a strategic cost beyond the immediate tactical outcome. The M3 had been an early warning of this reality, a physical manifestation of industrial war, replacing the older logic of elite formations and battlefield finesse. Meanwhile, American armored doctrine continued to evolve under combat pressure. Early experiences revealed vulnerabilities in armor protection and anti-tank capability, prompting changes in tactics rather than immediate redesigns. Crews learned to rely on maneuver, terrain, smoke, and supporting fires rather than frontal engagements against heavier enemy tanks. This emphasis on combined arms traced directly back to the M3's limitations, where survival depended on cooperation rather than brute force. Training manuals reflected this shift. The language moved away from heroic individual action and toward disciplined execution. Tank commanders were taught to think in terms of missions rather than duels, objectives rather than kills. The tank was framed as one component in a larger system, valuable not for its invincibility, but for its ability to move firepower to decisive points. This conceptual shift would define American armored operations for the remainder of the war. The M3's psychological impact lingered as well. Crews who had once endured ridicule for their ungainly machine developed a pragmatic confidence. They had seen firsthand that battlefield reputation did not determine outcomes, decisions did. They understood that victory often belonged to the side that accepted imperfection and acted decisively anyway. This mindset proved invaluable as the war moved into Europe's dense terrain, where uncertainty dominated every advance. By the time Allied forces landed in Italy and later in Normandy, the M3 itself was largely gone from frontline service. Yet its imprint remained visible in the tempo of operations. American units moved faster, accepted risk more readily, and recovered from setbacks with greater speed. They did not wait for flawless conditions. They advanced, adjusted, and advanced again. This operational rhythm, born during the M3's brief but intense service life, became a defining feature of Allied success. The story of the M3, then, is not confined to North Africa or to a single moment when it stopped Rommel's panzers. It extends into every later campaign where American armor operated as part of a vast, coordinated system under constant pressure. It exists in the decisions made when information was incomplete, equipment imperfect, and consequences irreversible. The tank that was mocked as obsolete had forced an army to confront modern war sooner than it expected, and in doing so, it reshaped how that army fought for the rest of World War II. As Allied planners assessed the cumulative effects of these changes, the lessons drawn from early armored engagements began influencing decisions far beyond the battlefield. Commanders at Army and Corps level increasingly planned operations around sustainment and momentum rather than single, decisive clashes. This approach reflected an understanding that modern war rewarded persistence under pressure. The M3's era had demonstrated that the side capable of returning to combat fastest, even with imperfect tools, gained an irreversible advantage over time. In operational planning rooms, the language of warfare shifted. Instead of asking whether a formation could win a single engagement, planners asked how long it could remain in contact and how quickly it could exploit success. This change was subtle but profound. It meant accepting casualties, mechanical losses, and uncertainty as constants rather than exceptions. The M3, with its obvious flaws and unexpected successes, had normalized this way of thinking within the Allied command structure. German reactions to this reality grew increasingly constrained. Defensive doctrines emphasized holding ground at all costs, often under direct orders that forbade withdrawal. These decisions magnified the effects of Allied material superiority. When German units were fixed in place, Allied armor and artillery could methodically apply pressure, knowing that time favored them. The early shock of facing M3s in North Africa had hinted at this imbalance, but it became fully apparent as the war progressed. At the tactical level, American armored units refined techniques that prioritized flexibility. Tank infantry teams advanced in bounding movements. Artillery observers embedded with forward elements adjusted fire in real time, and air support was integrated into ground operations with increasing precision. These methods reduced reliance on individual vehicle performance and emphasized system-wide effectiveness. The roots of this integration lay in the necessity imposed by the M3's design constraints. Veterans of the North African campaign often remarked that the hardest lessons were learned early, when mistakes were punished brutally. Those experiences fostered a culture that valued after-action analysis and rapid adaptation. Failures were documented, discussed, and addressed through changes in training rather than buried under rhetoric. This institutional willingness to learn became one of the Allied forces' most powerful, if intangible, advantages. Industrial feedback loops reinforced this adaptability. Reports from the field flowed back to factories and design bureaus, prompting incremental improvements rather than wholesale redesigns. Armor thickness increased in critical areas, ammunition stowage was modified for safety, and mechanical reliability continued to improve. The process was iterative and relentless, reflecting a strategic patience that contrasted sharply with German reliance on breakthrough technologies introduced too late or in insufficient numbers. As the war entered its later stages, the cumulative weight of these decisions became impossible to ignore. Allied armored formations operated with a confidence rooted not in technological dominance, but in predictability. They knew their supply lines would hold, their replacements would arrive, and their doctrine would support decisive action even in chaotic conditions. This confidence was earned during the uncertain period when the M3 represented both vulnerability and resolve. The battlefield itself bore witness to this transformation. Where early engagements had been tentative and fragmented, later operations unfolded with coordinated depth. Advances were planned with contingencies, reserves positioned to exploit opportunity, and logistics units moved forward almost as aggressively as combat troops. The rhythm of Allied warfare became relentless, compressing the enemy's decision-making cycle and eroding their capacity to respond effectively. In retrospect, the M3's contribution appears less dramatic than the iconic images of later tanks rolling through liberated cities. Yet its true impact lay in shaping expectations under stress. It forced commanders and crews alike to confront the realities of industrial war before they were fully prepared, and in doing so, it accelerated a transformation that might otherwise have come too late. The awkward machine that once drew laughter became an early instrument of a broader shift, one that redefined how the Allies fought, adapted, and ultimately prevailed in World War II.